At our last but not least, absolutely, presentation. We're really honored to have Professor Slotta with us. Let me introduce him. Jim Slotta holds the President's Chair in Knowledge Technologies at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, OISE, University of Toronto. For the past 25 years, he has led research studies of K-12 STEM inquiry, including powerful new roles for technology-enhanced learning environments. These studies have advanced the pedagogical model known as knowledge, community, and inquiry. In which students, I was afraid that somebody would join at the moment, in which students and teachers collaborate as a learning community to engage in STEM inquiry projects. Slotta currently directs the Encore Lab, in which KCI curriculum and technology environments are developed and researched. Previously, he worked at the University of California, Berkeley, and served as Associate Dean for Research in the Boston College School of Education between 2016 and 18. And during his career, he served as Principal Investigation Author co-PI on grant-funded projects totaling more than 40 million. Which is amazing, supervised more than 20 doctoral students to completion and published hundreds of manuscripts and proceedings papers. He's an experienced evaluator of educational programs and research projects. In 2018, he led a team that evaluated the presence of computational and design thinking with the International Baccalaureate's K-12 curriculum, including a survey of teachers and curriculum leaders from more than 5,000 schools worldwide. Slotta has experience working in the African context, including a prior NIH funded project to develop a community health worker assistive technology project, CHAT. Okay, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Jim Slotta to our colloquium tonight. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Enrica. If I knew that you were going to read that thing out loud, I probably would have sent, a shorter one.
No, but it's important because not all the students know you. So
yeah, well,
especially if they are in languages. And
the only important stuff is what you're working on right now, right? So I hear all that stuff as a history, right? And
but history is important. We shouldn't forget.
Now I'm working in India and China, and that's occupying a lot of my thinking. But I won't be talking to you about that today. Although we can maybe get into it later. Yeah. So let's see if I can. So good to meet you all. I am very appreciative of what the online learning space can do for us. We can bring people together. I mentioned I work in India and China, and I routinely meet with people at great distances, and all I have to do is walk across the hall and get on. So there's great opportunity and affordance for online, and I want to be respectful and appreciative. Also the inclusiveness that it can allow some people who can't get in. Those things are all real and true, but if you want to know my honest opinion about online learning is I don't prefer it. And I think that it's coming in as a sort of an invasive species in education, where in the name of expediency, which is never wrong, and also sometimes in the name of inclusiveness, which is never wrong. So that with these really powerful right arguments, it's sort of taking over, and it's hard to fight back against it because the face-to-face stuff is intrinsically, inefficient and intrinsically, hard to get in and has a lot of overhead. And honestly, we weren't that good at some of our face-to-face instruction. In my work, I'm trying to make it better, but with these big lecture halls and all that, a lot of students felt like, I could just as easily do that with a Zoom link. So it's up to us to make face-to-face learning the wonderful thing that it can be and the powerful thing that it can be, And that is really difficult to do online. I'll just say, I see Aisha here, but I don't see her, right?
Yeah.
I'm not with you, and it's hard for me to really talk about that in concrete or let's say tractable terms, because I think a lot of the benefits of face-to-face, or we could call it co-emplaced learning, are in that sort of longer tail, which if you know anything about stats, the long tail can hold an awful lot of the value in a sample, and I think we need to take a strong look at things that we took for granted before, because it's easy for them to lose in any kind of tally sheet and any kind of analysis, right? We need to really understand why it's important for us to be together, and maybe my talk will have something to do about that. Today, I spend a lot of my time thinking and wondering about physical space, the room, the furniture, the ceiling, the floor, the shared space, and the shared references that we have in a space, which teachers have done traditionally, and more in the primary years than in the secondary years. But it's a topic of inquiry to think about the physical classroom, and I also think about time quite a lot, thinking about time, curricular time, activity time within a lesson. What are you spending your time doing? I think about what we're there to learn. What are we supposed to learn here today together? Why are you even here? It's what you learn, it's also how you learn. So I often wonder about how we learn, and how we learn really affects what we learn, right? And so I'm also thinking a lot about why we're learning, which of course affects everything about how we would learn. So I'm thinking about time, space, what, how, why. Mostly for K-12, but sometimes for higher education. Let's see if I'll share screen here. And I'm just going to show you some slides today that kind of talk about I guess probably the last 10 to 15 years. The pandemic came in and scrambled time, which makes it difficult to remember even sometimes what the time frame is. But about 2008 or 9, I had a beginning of an inquiry project of my own called Knowledge, Community, and Inquiry. And it was trying to look at communities of learners within a classroom, not unlike what Scardamelia and Breiter are doing in the psychology realm with knowledge building. I was very interested in that collective cognitive responsibility that they talked about, but I wanted something a little bit more structural and activity centered, not as much idea centered. Their work is really focused on how to help a community grow ideas and build on those ideas, which is very, very sort of interesting. And I still really try to do knowledge building wherever I can. But I was interested in more of a structural curricular model. So I'll talk to you about that today. See if I can get slides to work. And I want to say that this work involves dozens of people, 2 or 3 major collaborating institutions, 10 years at least of work. But I want to situate it in something that you'll probably hear a lot about. And if I can at all possible, I'll look for ways to connect to LLE and to the work that you're possibly doing. But something you probably all heard a lot about is this drive for 21st century skills in education, K-12 in particular. I think higher ed would be a wonderful long conversation to have sometime about how higher ed is going to change. I think we're almost done with undergraduate degrees. I think we're going to see lifelong learning, upskilling, badges, and programs that are tailored for the individual. Probably a lot more interconnections with industry and workflow, because we know, if nothing else, we know that it's going to be a gig economy, and people graduating right now are basically, they don't know anything. The thing they probably know more than anything else is that they're going to need to keep learning and keep continually, jumping into new ponds and learning how to swim. So higher ed is going to be part of that, I think, at some level. And I think the days when we could get our degree and be ready to go for a life of work are pretty much over. That's going to have an impact on K-12 for sure. But in the meantime, you're going to hear a lot about this 21st century skills movement. Every Ministry of Education in Canada and around the world has essentially mandated that teachers address these skills. So we know the future of work is changing. Every time you look around, there's a new mode of learning. Now we got ChatGPT, right? We have social media. We have, this whole mode of understanding and learning has sort of shifted in real time in front of our eyes. And the pandemic has largely accelerated some of that. It's a time in the world when we know that there's big problems. We've just come through 3 years of something that I would call like an appetizer course, for what the next 30 are going to be. It was a really interesting moment for the world to have to be in something together. I think this might have been the first moment, if you think about it, when the world shared data, shared approaches, normed itself, paid attention to what was going on. The science came to the rescue around the world. And we were in it together. This whole world was in this thing together. And so that's going to be true of climate as well. It's going to manifest differently in all around the world, but it's going to be, storms and famine and wars and migration. And this generation of kids that are coming in, which include both of my kids, are going to basically have that as their kind of problem space. And that's not bad to have problems. They need something to work on. You're not going to solve climate change, right? You are going to respond to climate change, and that's what the world is going to be doing. And so there's an educational opportunity for you, maybe more than any previously. It's likely that education, learning, and innovation will be at the heart of this. And these pictures are from China because I've been talking a lot in China about this lately. But you want to ask, how do K-12 schools, you're still gonna teach them algebra and reading? Like skills are important, but what else? What other kind of skills do we need? And so there's this great movement around the world, which I applaud, of thinking about how to integrate these kind of things into the curriculum: critical thinking, design, collaboration, problem solving, computational thinking. You can't do any of them in lecture. Okay, so traditional methods are right out. And if you think about that, from a teacher's perspective, it's a bit nerve-wracking to be told that your didactic, pedagogies are ill-suited to today. But I want to say that we have very little to offer them in terms of how they could replace. We have a lot of innovative ideas and insights, but for a teacher, which is a very pragmatic kind of role to play, you have to go in to work every day and do something in the classroom. And just telling these teachers that they have to put critical thinking and creativity into their curriculum is not an answer for them. And furthermore, it's not like we even have solved how to do that. That's the kind of thing I'm working on right now, and I hope you'll see. So this is a frictional time in schools right now where messages are coming down, but no real solutions are being offered. And at the end of this talk, I'll mention a project that we're just starting here at OISE to look more at that. But I guess trying to find some of the threads of promise that are there. This is a kind of a time when multidisciplinarity is being seen as part of that fabric. Inquiry and problem-based learning, project-based learning are coming in. Engineering has risen up as a kind of a K-12 topic certainly in the US. That's true if you can get around some of the political movements. Engineering is seen as this wonderful opportunity for students to learn how to apply math, science, art, tech Okay, so there's a movement away from the deconstructed, topical coverage and into more coherent and integrated multidisciplinary projects with cross-cutting themes, like future cities is one that I work with a lot. Sustainable futures, and thinking about health and food and habitat and energy, right? You can really get students to work with that. How do they learn the same content that way that they used to learn the other way? It's not easy. It might not be possible. There's a depth versus breadth trade-off. And if you go to China, or if some of you are from China, the secondary schools there are really focused on covering a lot of content to help prepare students for these difficult, university exams. So convincing Chinese teachers to try this out has been a really interesting trick. It basically means you have to give up some of the content coverage. Hopefully you get back more depth of understanding and more, connections between topics, but these are open and continuing questions. We'll have to see how they play out. Oh, okay, so you'll see a lot about STEAM, there's science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. And it doesn't mean we're just going to throw an A into STEM. I mean, the reason that A is there often is that the arts bring a way of knowing and a way of being together that's powerfully disruptive to some of those older kind of didactic methods of learning. And so art has been seen as a way, not only to add creativity and expression, but also to sort of shake up the epistemology of learning a bit. And I'm certainly very interested in that. So STEAM inquiry, you've all seen makerspaces, and, this is probably a picture by some makerspace producer. It looks like it's going really well. Kids are engaged and excited and diverse, right? And but I believe there's something to this, really. And essentially, STEAM inquiry can involve making like this. It can involve building a compost for your school. It can involve designing models. It can involve hacking solutions to community problems, right? So a lot of this work is happening. I mentioned the learning sciences earlier, and that's an area where there's a lot of investigation into STEAM learning, and particularly thinking about, the pedagogy of that. Like, what does that mean? Just getting you to make something is not an answer, right? We need a recipe for that. We need we need more than a recipe for that. We need a kind of a meal plan as well, because just making a recipe for an activity doesn't give you a curriculum that it fits into. But I want to still kind of keep singing the promises of this, because there's another issue with student learning right now. I think it's always been there, but I know it's true now, and I know it's even more true after the pandemic, that we've got a sort of an epidemic of identity crisis going on, anxiety amongst middle school and high school students, where they don't really believe us when we tell them anything. Greta Thunberg is the adult in the room, right? They go marching out on strike against the adults that are clueless, and Greta's lecturing the United Nations, and that's kind of true. The adults in the room are, we're sort of clinging to the status quo, partly because we don't really know another way to do it. But the kids are aware that this is not that this approach to education isn't going to help them solve the problem of what they're going to do with their lives and how they're going to survive this gig economy and the inequity of the world and the climate change that's coming. And the schools really aren't doing a good job of engaging students around that meaning making, around identity development and formation, right? And I think that STEAM inquiry projects offer one way that can happen. It doesn't mean it's going to happen if you just do a STEAM inquiry project. I think you have to build in identity formation into that, but I'm very interested in that part of this kind of curriculum. So I'm going to try to go a little faster now, but you get the picture, right? We're trying to foster these new patterns of interaction, and this means everything changes. And you go to a classroom where this stuff is happening, you're not going to see teacher lecturing, right? It's students collaborating, talking, debating, researching, designing, teachers, on one knee talking to kids, having an argument, getting a question and having to go find the answer. The teacher turning around and challenging the class, right? Things that are not planned. And this is not easy to teach this way, by the way. But that's what happens in these classrooms. Students using their phones and various kinds of technology. Students learning from one another, teachers learning from students. It sounds kind of revolutionary, and it is, right? So these new methods of project-based inquiry, multidisciplinary STEAM learning they're definitely an old idea within the learning sciences, within educational research. People have talked about project-based, problem-based for a while now. And like I say, it's not a solved problem either. It's not like we can just turn a crank and make this and it works. We have a whole bunch of research that have happened. We have a whole bunch of things we can say about it, but it's not ready for mainstream where you could just swap this into schools and classrooms. So I want to make sure at least that's my opinion. And I think that's why teachers aren't jumping, stuff's not leaping off the shelves into classrooms right now, because a teacher that says, I want to try it, quickly confronts the fact that it doesn't buy them any more than that intention. They still have to do all this work to see if they can design something where kids do this and are not just wasting time, or at least that they're making progress in the direction the teacher is responsible for them to make progress in. So another topic you'll hear me talk about is smart classrooms. These are not classrooms that turn the lights out when you leave, right? These are rooms that, and not necessarily high-tech classrooms either. You could imagine active learning rooms, which are quite prominent in the world today. These are rooms that have movable furniture and writable walls and color coding and lots of configurable rooms. Makerspace is another one. These are not just rooms, makerspaces, where you're going to go learn how to 3D print, right? In fact, 3D printers are almost never used by anyone anywhere ever. They're all dusty, all of them. So forget them for now. But really, the makerspace is about this kind of designing, inventing, creating, collaborating, using media that aren't necessarily even electronic, but using a wide range of media to do that kind of learning. Then you got experiential learning, which includes the community-based service, going out and intersecting with the world, which was not always the philosophy of schooling, but increasingly it is, and outdoors and field trips and studying the local, climate as it's manifesting in their community. And I'll just add learning across contexts. Sometimes the pandemic sends us home, right? I'd be lying if I denied that was a thing that we had to do. And we can still do 21st century learning that way, but we need to figure out how. And then I think it's always true that there's homework, and that what happens in that homework can come back into class, right? And that what happens in class should feed into homework. And so how to kind of use those contexts that get students jump between is another major problem. Here, there's some pictures of the kind of rooms that you'll see out in the world. Don't need any cats in this talk. Okay. Classes, schematics. There's no end of this stuff. If you go search on the web for smart classroom, a lot of people think they're just high-tech rooms, right? And that's not my view of them. This is closer. But it's interesting to look at everything. All right, I mentioned learning communities earlier. This is an approach to pedagogy, to thinking about how you can support learning. It focuses on the whole classroom. So kids aren't competing with each other, trying to get better grades or scores. They're actually listening to each other and trying to learn from and help one another make progress. Okay, so their inquiry actually depends on their peers, if you do it right. And everyone's out to advance the whole community. So they all kind of understand this, the epistemics of this, from the idea that the community is what it's about. Okay. There's a notion of student contributed material, which is increasingly common probably in your own courses, right? You used to get the material from the prof, and read and all that. But increasingly, we're following the web and following the media of the last 20 years, where it's about people creating the content. You know, YouTube and Google, all of it were empty. Wikipedia, empty when it started. They didn't make any content. The people create the content. And so that can be true in a curriculum as well, if you do it right. In my work, you'll see that there's this idea of a knowledge base that they all kind of identify with and build together. So a lot of, like, you know, hierarchical structures here, where you've got groups, you got individuals, you got whole class. You maybe have people moving within and between groups, like Jigsaw, that sort of thing. And then I think if you look at that literature, some of the big names are cited up above, you'll find a lot of emphasis on the kind of discourse that's happening. Is it didactic talk where the teacher is explaining something, or is it, you know, focused on tasks and exchanges and asking questions and making advances, right? So the teacher is often thinking about helping students make progress on their inquiry, not telling them about some ideas and content. So this is a KCI model. If you read the papers, you know, I won't go too deep into this, but this thing kind of came together over about 2 or 3 years of working with different boxes. And I don't think it's done yet. We're still adding a notion of student identity into this model. That's something I'm working on right now, is to how to really understand how activities, these red boxes, intersect with individuals, even within a community construct. So, but basically you see here that there's a process of collaborative knowledge construction. It's going to produce this knowledge base. Here's some scaffolded inquiry activities. They're going to use that knowledge base and also contribute more to it. They're going to produce some accessible learning outcomes. That's a requirement of the model. So if you design a curriculum according to KCI, you will produce something that the teacher can look at that can show that the students learned the target for that model. And then into this wonderful design, you've got 2 important things, which are, first of all, what are the learning goals and expectations the teacher has to cover? And then second, which could include 21st century competencies. And then second, what's the community saying? What's it concerned about? What's it interested in? How does their voice come into defining these activities? So it's a very tricky business of designing one of these, because you kind of have to leave it unbound and let the community voice help you, you know, bind it in the end. So it's also not always easy to talk or write about it either. But within KCI, we've got epistemological bits. So you'd have to tell the students, this is how we're going to learn. It's going to be like this, and we're all doing this. You give them examples from the sciences and show them what together learning really means. You got this kind of knowledge construction. You've got these projects that use that. And okay, these things are long. The most of the KCI units I've done are semester length courses. And the reason for that is, I want to prove that that's what we can do. We're not just building a little add-on 1 week thing that a teacher can sort of endure or tolerate. Like they'll say, that's how we're getting our competencies. I want to prove that this could be a replacement unit. We can teach 12th grade physics this way, teach 12th grade biology this way. Okay, so most of the work I've done with KCI has been in that vein, because it's interesting. So some of the principles in the model that I guess you read, each one, you know, the way I write about it includes the epistemological commitment, the pedagogical affordances, and the technology kind of characteristic technology elements. So in this one, it's students work collectively creating a knowledge base that serves as a resource for their inquiry within a learning domain. And that means that that knowledge base is indexed with semantic metadata to that domain. There's epistemological commitments there, pedagogy and technology. If you know anything about activity systems, you know, if this is a KCI principle, it looks a little bit like, and it actually is, if you stare at it, you know, it's not kind of far off of a Engstrom's activity system, where these things are kind of mapped to elements of an activity system. If I change the the technology scaffolds, I'll probably end up messing around with these two as well, that they sort of change in concert. Three more principles that we got here are that the knowledge base has to be a resource accessible for editing improvement. Collaborative inquiry is designed to address the targeted domain goals. So I have to, if I'm going to engage the kids in designing a sustainable city and it's in a biology plants unit, then they're going to have to focus on food, and they're going to have to focus on food and sustainability, regenerative farming, understanding meiosis, mitosis, like the whole 9 yards got to come in. Not easy to do. A fourth one here is that the teacher's role has to be specified. So you don't just say to the teacher, like, kind of, your job is to help this all work. Just be a guide on the side. And I find that that's a really unhelpful thing to tell to a teacher. Versus here's what you should be doing now. Here's what you should be monitoring to see any evidence of this. Here's several of the patterns that you should keep in mind. Here's what you're ultimately trying to get these kids to, right? Let's explicate that. So that's the model. Sounds vague. And what happens to individual students? So I'm still working on that, but just to, the way I think about individual students is they're like particles in a bubble chamber. They just kind of come through all these structured activities, and they're going to differ, all of them. And it's in a community, so they're all kind of giving what they've got and getting what they need. But they sort of take, according to constructivist principles, they get affected by this, and they come out the other end, hopefully with more than just learning in a content, but 21st century competencies. And if my current work is on, then I would say, identity formation as well. So the kind of research methods that we use in all this work, I named this model-based design research. There's design-based research that you can read about that's very, very interesting, and I think relevant to all of you. There's model, and you won't find in Creswell. There's model-based research, which is less common because models aren't very common. It's not actually that common to have a model. And if you do have a model, it's a wonderful thing, I can tell you. You end up giving talks about it, but basically you can test it. You can give me a curriculum, like you could design a curriculum according to KCI, and I can look at it and say, that doesn't meet the model. It doesn't produce the assessable outcome. The knowledge base isn't indexed to the learning goals. There's no specification of the teacher's role. So the model is kind of helpful, right? And so design-based research is one where essentially the designed outcome, the outcome of the research is actually a design. So it's a curriculum on future cities that focuses on food, sustainable food, right? And so I don't build that curriculum to test to see if the model's any good. I use the model to design that curriculum, and then I learn from doing that design, including how the students and teacher engage. So design-based research was created by Anne Brown and others, but Brown in '92 really kind of launched it and talked about how this was a methodology that was suitable for the kind of messiness, intrinsic, complexity of learning that you just can't do controlled studies. It's not even possible to think about them in a lot of these cases. So you use the design as a way of capturing that complexity and that richness. Again, I mentioned these are substantial, and they're always done with a teacher, which Jeremy Rochelle and others have written about co-design. It's a little bit more than participatory design, if you've heard about that. You're sort of getting really married to the teacher as a design partner, and what comes out, the researcher doesn't just help the teacher understand KCI and design to it, right? No. The teacher actually has to be in charge of this. They have to be a major voice in the design of this. And so both the teacher and the researcher end up, giving and getting quite a lot. And what comes out the other end is something, if done right, that the teacher owns. The teacher does not need the researcher to help, explain anything to them because they were part of that design. And it's a great methodology, and it's also a bit of an idealized one. It's always the case that teachers are short on time. Researchers have a lot more time because they're super invested in it. So you end up having to kind of do your best. So this is an older slide, but it's also not, whoops. not all showing. You're missing the, oopsie. Yeah, you're missing the, fix it quickly. There's more to it. There's even more to it than it's on here, but it certainly would be nice if it all showed up. Let's see. Enrica mentioned 20 doctorates or something. This is a lot of them. Just to sort of show that, you know, since, well, now 10 years more, we've been taking on these substantial projects and doing PhD studies on them. There's another 4 or 5 after this that aren't shown here, but they always kind of follow that methodology. And I'm going to talk to you about a couple of them. Let me check my time. Yes, quickly. So orchestrating is another piece of this. Okay, and I've got here a picture from Pierre Dillenberg's book. But how, when you can give me the design and I'll read about it. Maybe we don't have formalisms that to represent design, so we usually use paragraphs and tables for lesson plans, and we have different ways of showing what a curriculum looks like, and I can read all about it, but that's not the same as running it. Okay, so when you run a 12-week biology curriculum that includes all kinds of smart classroom stuff, you're going to find out it's not what's written on that paper. It's actually what happens in real time. It's like producing a play from a script, right? There's a wonderful script that you can read and laugh with, you know, but then when you see that thing performed, it's got a life of its own. And so we call that orchestration, and that's a term that's used in my field, learning sciences. So we have scripting and orchestration is about, it's about making the script happen, but it's also about making it come alive. And it's about responding in real time, because a lot of that script, you can't specify every single thing in an inquiry model or in a collective, you know, community model. You can't specify every single thing they're doing. So you need to have more kind of qualitative parameters around it. And you're looking for ways to help the teacher attend and respond. And the technology can help. So you can imagine, in my mind, I see the classroom space, the teacher, and the technological kind of all the technology, phones, boards, you know, laptops, all of it kind of working together to help orchestrate those complex designs. And I'll show you some examples. I want to mention learning analytics because some of you have probably heard of, you know, data science and educational data mining. I think that's really true. We can predict where the flu is going from, you know, Google searches. But there's real-time learning analytics, which is, I think, increasingly interesting to me. And that has to do with, in this room, who just searched on something, and can I actually give some feedback to the teacher in real time of what's happening, or to some intelligent systems, right? So learning analytics kind of capture and respond to student interaction patterns, to user-contributed content, processing, giving feedback, teacher dashboards. You know, you've heard of some of this stuff. Well, in my work, I'm very serious about this opportunity, which includes, you know, kind of intelligent agents that are back there in a smart classroom. You've got a server somewhere, and it's listening to everything. It knows who you're working with, what you're working on, what you just found, what you're doing now. If you're stuck, what's the teacher doing? So ideally, that sort of room is kind of aware of what's happening. And we've done a few projects on this. Okay, so I mentioned I'm interested in place. This is actually kind of current work of mine. Is I'm thinking about classrooms, right? What do we do when we throw a bunch of people in a room? You know, what can the room actually help us with? What can it do for us, right? We do know there's a sense of identity. So elementary, you know, my son's teacher calls them room 204, right? Hey, room 204, right? And they all know that room. They all know what's in that room and where it is, and they breathe the same air, right? It's a more powerful moment, I think, than people realize, to have a shared building, classroom, sense of space, because you're there. That's where you are. You're nowhere else. You're in that place. Are you in another place? No, I'm in this place now. And you are too. Wow, we're together. You know, there's 20 of us. It's uniquely defines us as co-located. And so the power of that place has often been taken for granted. because we didn't have to worry. First of all, now I find myself having to justify place. But, over the last hundreds of years, place was without, we didn't have, that wasn't a thing we had to defend or define. We just had it. Now I'm telling you, we're going to have to understand this better. But I do believe there's a large power in these places that can be used for learning that hasn't always been. It's usually been setting up desks in a row and like letting the teacher lecture. But that's not the way it has to be. So I think a lot about how to leverage that physical place as well as objects in the place. Objects can have, well, you've heard about Internet of Things and some intelligence that we can put into objects. So I'm thinking quite a bit about that too. And I think about time. What is it about a long-running project? Teachers always afraid of it, right? Oh, that's going to take too much classroom time. And it's 2 weeks. Oh my gosh, it's a long time. Well, a unit in most K-12 and secondary anyway is about 10 weeks of time. So thinking about how those units can cohere and what are the kind of strands that can run through it is very interesting to me. What are the boundary objects that can be at the intersection of various contexts that can support? I mentioned homework. There's a bunch of things that could sort of serve as temporal integrators. All right. How can we manipulate time in our favor? Okay. So that's just some big questions of mine. I mentioned smart classrooms earlier. Here's one that we built here in Toronto. I'll talk to you just quickly through it so you can just see as an example. I think you might have even read a paper about it. This was a 12-week high school unit in biology. We had the room was given to us by the school, which if you know as anything about how valuable rooms are in schools, this is like worth, well, I don't know, maybe now it's changed, but back in 2009, this was worth like $1 billion, right? To have the school give you a room that you could, in this case, we could take a lot of time setting all this stuff up, playing with it. This is a multi-touch table here. We had computers everywhere. We had these kids all carrying iPads and tablets that helped them. So we built this room, but the teacher who's shown here, she didn't teach her whole 12-week biology class in this room. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about how we use that room and multiple contexts, which included classroom, home, zoo, smart room. Okay, to do this was at UTS school, which is nearby Oise, and a very high achieving school. So these kids were, well, in my experience, these are really good contexts to do this kind of work. It doesn't mean that I'm only thinking about those kind of students in classrooms, but if you're trying to make a very complicated thing work in multimodal technologies, it's helpful when you can kind of start with really dedicated kids, dedicated teacher. We can talk more later if you want about how that could possibly move into the kind of more mainstream, but my work has not been about mainstream solutions. My work has been about investigating a new model of collective inquiry. Okay, so I'm not apologizing for this classroom context. I'm accounting for why it was a helpful one to start with a high resourced school. And I can talk to you lots about, but you can imagine how often I've had that conversation. So this is actually work from Michelle Louis, who's a new faculty member at Oise. She was hired this year after about 6 years of postdocs, and she's back. And her question was, okay, let's say I have a big smart room and I can do anything I want with it, right? I want to turn it into kind of a cave, like a projection simulation where the whole class walks into it. And I want to understand what that could do for collective inquiry. How can that support learning instruction and not just be a an aquarium that, this is famous for aquariums and zoos. You take the kids there and they get all excited about the big pretty fish, but they're not using that experience in direct service to their learning, right? So we wanted to try to do something more meaningful, where the kids were exhausted at the end of their experience here. Going to work them hard, right? So we built a rainforest in Southeast Asia, Sumatra, and we built it at 8 different time periods: 200, 150 million, 200 million years ago, 150 million, 100, 50, 25, 10, 5, and 2. And Michelle's an artist, so she rendered this room using Flash at all of those 8 points in time. And so the teacher with their iPad could actually play the room through time, could move it from 200 to 150. And the kids would see the animals change and the species evolve, right? And then at the front of the room there, you see very small, we had this kind of emergent collective product that the kids had to build as they went through all 8 of those stages to make this kind of representation of the species. And I'll show you more about that down the road. Some of these are videos and some aren't. I'm not sure which ones are, but some of the objects that were in these rooms are, you see kids working on their own iPads. You see this front board that showed the big public display that the teacher would go and touch. Each of these was touchable and they would pop up content. These large animated walls. Here's a video. So this might just show you, I'm not sure how good the sound is going to be, but I don't have very many videos. So this will just show you what it looked like. And what it looked like is really something we were very interested in. We didn't know what this was going to be like. Okay, so here's. So hopefully you hear the audio.
No, we don't hear the audio. You have to put the same as system.
Let's see.
If you hear that, you just go on same as system and we should be able to hear.
So if I go zoom, oh, it's when I share screen, I said do it, don't I?
Yeah, you go near the mic.
There we
There is
go.
that little thing and you do same as yeah.
Got it. Let's try it again. Let's see if that was a fast fix. So we did a lot of work with the ambience in this room. We put big, nice computer speakers everywhere and brought some fake plants and
yeah, now we hear.
So you've seen all this. They just kind of, they're in the room. The lights are out. They feel, it felt pretty good. It felt like a fairly immersive. And they're fixated on solving this problem at the front of the room, which is building this kind of 200 million year cladogram. And you see them sitting in small groups there. You see them talking around their table. The teacher is probably somewhere. Here she is talking to them about something. That's what it looked like. Okay, that's all I can tell you. Video is worth 1,000 words.
Mm-hmm.
How did we do it? How do we make it happen? What was it actually that we made to happen? So I guess one question we had, I'm looking at the time now, you know, thinking about that rainforest room, we didn't know. So we didn't want to bring the kids in and just have them be like novices coming into this room. We wanted them to come in with some activated knowledge that would then be relied upon. So what we did was we showed them the room in its current biodiversity, and we had a nice activity where they had to kind of solve some problems. And then we told them that we were going to work with a designer, namely Michelle, who was going to build that room at over 200 million years. And we gave the kids the responsibility of finding out what species were in that room at 20, we assigned them to one of those eight time stages, and they had to actually do the flora, the fauna, the insects. I think it was insect. Well, it was 3 or 4 groups that they had to sort of give that material over the next 8 weeks to the designer, who then made the rainforest room. So when it came time to going in the room, the kids had this investment, and especially when it was their time period, they were docents for the others in the room. So they kind of got to be like the 50 million year group, and they helped the kids make sense of the species that were in there. So this shows 12 weeks of time, and it shows particular homeworks that were important to us, particular visits to the Evo room, which is that room, and also trips to the zoo, which is a field trip. So you get a sense that KCI was this long curriculum that involved building a knowledge base that challenged them to understand biodiversity and habitat and evolution. And I'm going to have to probably zip now because we're coming up. These are just kind of some shots of things that were that you show the community progress here at the front of the room. And when it started out, there was they were 200 million years ago. So this thing kind of built as you went through time. There's a teacher. So this is a second example. I guess I'm gonna have to show it really fast, but it's basically one where we took the room and we buried a simulation throughout the room. So these are called embedded phenomena, and they're temporally persistent, which means they're running 24/7, 365. And this is my colleague, Tom Moore here, that's collaborated with me for years, and he's situating classroom learners as investigators of science phenomenon in which they are spatially and temporally immersed. So Tom liked EvoRoom, but he's a computer scientist, and his inventions are very interesting. So this is Walkology, for example. And Walkology is, you tell the kids that there's bugs everywhere in the room, in the walls, and you can't see them because they're behind the walls. But if you put one of these like computer monitors on the wall, they can see an X-ray into the wall. And then they can see all these kind of food webs and predator prey things, and they have to do some sort of investigations of them. And Tom's got about 5 or 6 of these that he's created over the years. This is what one of them looked like back in 2012, just running. There's little bugs, big bugs, scum, mold, predators, prey. If I move through it, you can sort of see, something interesting happen. Well, you can see things hatching and eating each other. And the teacher initially says, like, I don't know what this is. The kids have to kind of figure it out. They have to talk and look for things that happen. And then when they do, we give them some nice tools to help them. These are grade 5, 6 kids, to help them record their observations, but then to help those observations become part of the community knowledge base. Oh yeah, so we've updated that tech, and so here's what it looks like now, using Unity 3D. So we have much more realistic predator prey. You can see bits fly out when they eat each other, and different camera angles. But these habitats in the walls differ between one wall and the next. So one wall might have bricks and the other one might have plaster. They also might have slightly different temperatures. So they end up getting different creatures, and they have to sort of solve the problem.
They're in the wall, they can't hear you.
Well, they should. Let's try a different view.
Yeah, because we've only been on
No. You're like the opposite side.
All right, you get the idea. These kids are kind of engaged trying to solve these problems, and we give them, a challenge to try to solve, to sort of say, take care of this wall and figure out what species are in there and who's eating what, and let's build a food web. And then at the end, about 4 weeks of this, we hit each of so we break them into groups of 6, and they have responsibility for one. They take stewardship of one wall. And then we end up hitting that wall with a disaster, right? We give, one of them gets an invasive species, one of them gets a temperature jumps, and everything dies, right? And the kids come in and they're freaked out, and they have to kind of respond. So there's a sense of stewardship and kind of have you can't lower the temperature again, so we need to start again. There's maybe one species survived. Like, how do we kind of get biodiversity here? And that's another 4 or 5 weeks of doing that. And we ran this over at the Jackman Institute for Child Studies. I'm not going to really have time to talk about Rebecca Quintana's work, but she was really interested in how to help kids do individual sort of inquiry, but then have that show up in a collective format. So there's thousands of ways you could represent this stuff. How can you help students and teachers make progress? And so for her, let's say we were trying to do the life cycles. If you saw this blue thing turn into this green thing, you'd have an iPad if you were a kid, and you would drag the blue thing down to here, green thing down to here, you'd hit enter, and you'd go look for some more, right? Over time, those get aggregated, and the teacher at the front of the room had a whiteboard that she could touch this green thing, and show how many people said, you know, this blob turned into it, this thing. 2 people said this turned into it, but 20 people said this turned into it. You know, 8 people said it turned into itself. But she can use this as an object of inquiry. And, you know, they actually loved it when there was some, you know, conflict and they had like 12 people said this and 8 people said this. Obviously, the egg and the larva and the pupa and the adult stages, there's only one thing can turn into it. So how are we going to solve that? And they actually, you know, these Jackman teachers, they loved that opportunity to have the kids argue why and how they could try to resolve it. And so this was Rebecca's research to kind of look at some tools that she could build to help the kids interact discreetly, and then the teacher be able to kind of bring that discourse pattern to the room. And that's what Rebecca did her master's thesis on and went on. Okay, well, I'm at the end. Just to say that, you know, collective inquiry gives everyone in the classroom meaning and purpose. It changes the discourse and the activity that happens. Scripting and orchestration is about kind of designing that screenplay and then producing it. Models can help. Technology can help. Smart classrooms are one of the areas of my work. Looking at place as a sort of organizer or fixing of topics and activities as a physical space where things like wallcology can be indexed in the room, as an ambient space where there might be things around the room, as a place to support serendipitous interactions or people kind of almost intentionally run into each other. Observable inquiry, so we can actually look at the room and see what's going on. So I'm thinking about all that stuff. And in particular, I'm thinking lately in partnership with the MT program here at OISE, where they've been, you know, we were lucky to submit a CFI project and got that funded. The argument was that we're producing a lot of teachers, and these teachers are getting out into these schools, and they're being given these active learning rooms and these maker spaces, and we don't really talk to them about how to use that in a curricular way. And so we argued that we needed these kind of classroom spaces to support our research of how pre-service instruction can help new teachers learn this stuff. It's a lot, believe me, I'm thinking about it a lot. So it's not an easy problem, but we're going to research it. And, you know, we got the money to build these big spaces down on 3rd floor, and one of them's a maker space. So we'll be sort of helping teachers learn new teachers learn how to potentially teach in a maker space. And that means not teaching them technical things. That means history teachers using a maker space to help their kids produce a personally relevant historical monument or something like that. Sociology, religion, language, right? Makerspace for language. Got to figure it out. So we're going to be doing that. And that's happening now. And I'm sorry, I might have taken a bit time more than I should have.